Bitcoin and its forks have done pretty well so far, but is there some kind of an innovation dead end looming ahead? Will they be able to compete in the future? Now, of course, Bitcoin being the first great cryptocurrency came out and acquired quite a bit of the market share. In fact, 100% in the beginning, and then 90, then 85, and then down to like 40%, 30, what is it today? And it's still on top of the heap for very good reasons. And as we've seen with so many of its children that have come after it, it got a lot of things right that no one else really got right after that. Proof of work seems to work pretty well, at least at its base. A stable coin emission that gets mined by everyone, gets it out there everywhere. It's good decentralized supply. Limited supply is good. The economics of the miners, including transactions and, working to secure the network in exchange for their money, all that kind of stuff. The base model of Bitcoin works quite well. And that's why the major Bitcoin forks have still kind of stuck around, because they basically say, hey, let's take the basic model, the tried and true proven model. Let's take that and let's, at the very minimum, just make the block size a lot bigger so you can just scale right away. Whereas Bitcoin is trying to do it on the Lightning Network, which is a whole nother ball of wax. It's a whole nother thing that has its own issues, its own things to work through, its own developmental timeline and stuff. It's not just does it work like Bitcoin? Not really. It's its own thing. Of course, some of these have added little tweaks here and there. Oh, let's change a difficulty adjustment here. Let's add in some old opcodes there. Let's do some other things like that just to make it a little bit more competitive. But all of the Bitcoin forks have been kind of losing market share. It's really hard to effectively evaluate their adoption too, but those signs aren't really looking that phenomenal either. I'm not saying that they're doing poorly or anything. They're doing great so far, but relative to the rest of the space, there's so much innovation out there. So many new projects coming up with new things. DeFi is on fire. Everything's going like a million miles a minute. And then you have the old steady ones that are still kind of doing the same thing. And a lot of the space and the mind share is kind of leaving them behind a little bit. And there's an interesting perspective here from, of all places, the Bitcoin Cash world, but more specifically Bitcoin Unlimited. Bitcoin Unlimited put out a Bitcoin Unlimited improvement proposal, BIP 166, which basically calls for the creation of an entirely new cryptocurrency, again, as if there weren't enough forks of Bitcoin already, but I digress, to serve as, I guess, a test net or a proving ground or something to allow features to be deployed on Bitcoin Cash later. But first, let's try them on a real network with real money involved and see if they work out. And this proposal by Andrew Stone does kind of lead a lot of interesting tidbits into the mind of people who are frustrated with the lack of acceleration or development, or basically can see that there is a dead end coming without some sort of action. So even though this is just relevant to Bitcoin Unlimited, which is just relevant for the most part to Bitcoin Cash, I think it speaks a lot to the rest of the Bitcoin space, the Bitcoins space, and where they're at. And I think there's a lot of truth that can kind of be gleaned from there. So let's take a look at this. However, it should be completely obvious to all that there is minimal to zero use of and interest in testnet features that have no roadmap to deployment. Investing the time and effort to deliver even a simple minimum viable product based on these technologies will not happen. The most obvious barrier to such an effort is finding the venture capitalists willing to risk such an uncertain deployment. But the second is probably more important. Displaying such a project on a testnet simply invites competition that can be fully ready by the time the required consensus changes are deployed in Bitcoin Cash. Alright, there's a lot to unpack here, even though that wasn't really very many words, but let's look at some of the major issues. So the first problem, of course, as old as Bitcoin is, its consensus mechanism, Nakamoto consensus, and the way that has, I guess, proved very efficient at deciding what is the dominant network, while at the same time allowing non-dominant networks to exist or die off in some cases. But it's not been great for making decisions. The social component of everyone wants to decide, do we do this? Do we do the other thing? How do we come together? What if we disagree? What happens? That has kind of failed in that if you disagree, you basically have to run your competition coin against Bitcoin on the same network and hope that you win out to where there's not a split, or if there's a split, hopefully your split off ends up succeeding and doing well. And so because there's no real way of arriving at a conclusion for governance before splitting off, then a lot of stuff just doesn't tend to be done. A lot of decisions just don't tend to be made. This is why we still see Bitcoin with the same hashing algorithm, the same difficulty adjustment, the same block size, all these kinds of things that are very similar. And then the rest of the world is sort of moving ahead and it's kind of being stuck behind. Not that people aren't trying to implement things. Like, of course, Taproot is, depending on when you're watching this, either already implemented or on its way. There are some things that are getting in there, but it's just not huge world-breaking changes, especially not hard forks, because, the community hates to decide. And apparently the same problems happen with Bitcoin Cash. Now, Bitcoin SV sort of headed this off at the pass by just saying, you know what, we're not going to do anything. The only thing we're going to do after we re-enable all these new opcos, which someone had to decide that, I guess. But anyway, is the only thing we're going to do is keep making the block size bigger, and then everything else just happens, whatever. It remains to be seen if they're going to stick to their guns at that point, but, whatever. Now, Stone's lament in the BUIP 166 is that stuff just doesn't get implemented. Like, people work hard, they make upgrades, they debate about it, maybe it gets deployed on the testnet, and no one ever cares enough, we're fine, and just it doesn't move fast enough. There's no action, there's no decision making, which displays a governance issue. But not only if he's right. Of course, if he's right and he says, I think there's a governance issue, I don't think we decide to change things quickly enough. Of course he's right. But if he's not right, it also displays a governance issue, because there should be somewhere through the pipeline, if he's just one guy who wants to turn Bitcoin Cash into his own personal testnet and do whatever he wants and screw up the main chain and just whatever, there should be somewhere along that process that just tells him no, that tells him, no, you're wrong, you're in the minority, shut up, stop. There should have been somewhere there, but because it just kind of left out to whatever, like fork if you care kind of thing, because of that attitude behind the mechanisms, it's easy to see why everyone kind of thinks that they're not only right but in the majority somehow. And then that's why you have this disagreement, and then it never gets resolved. It's kind of like, imagine if you were watching a combat sport or just a sport, right? And the rules are not clearly enough defined, so at the end of the competition, both sides say, I won that match, I won that fight. And it should be abundantly clear that one did and one didn't. But when you're having too many of these, I won, no, I won kind of things, and it's unresolved, that's a governance issue. I've covered the governance issue in Nakamoto Consensus many, many times. The problems have resulted in a major hard fork every time a significant issue arises. But even worse, none of the Bitcoins have significantly changed over the past decade. Meanwhile, lots of chains, especially in the DeFi space, keep surging forward, and the market is reacting. Of course, governance is a structural issue, but it might be difficult, but you can kind of move past it. But you can't overcome a governance problem when compounded with also a culture problem. Remember that these are decentralized projects that while anyone can use them, who's running them, who's directing them and all that, the answer of that is people. Lots of people are involved. Lots of people write the code, run nodes, get the message out there, onboard new users, build businesses around it. That's all people. And if you have the wrong people, or you have the right people with the wrong attitude or whatever, you can have the most polished governance system in the world that really effectively makes decisions. You don't have any splits or anything. It's just it's a well-oiled, great machine. And the people can still make poor decisions because they have a culture or an identity, or the people involved aren't what is necessary to take it to the next level. Now, of course, having an effective governance system tends to make that sort of a thing not happen, or I should say not happen as much. But at the end of the day, culture can actually, make or break a project. And that's kind of where we're at with Bitcoin. Bitcoin's whole thing was it was original, it was number one, it just the old ways work. And in response to forks and challenges, its culture has become much more ideological around the original things that it created. A lot more, 21 million ever, and few understand this, and everyone should run their own node, and just all that kind of culture, the worship of the way things used to be, kind of makes it so that that's the way things will always be. And of course, Bitcoin Cash had its same old thing of Bitcoin used to be spendable, used to be, and then that whole culture wasn't just let's have an effective cryptocurrency that is useful for all those things. It's just but it has to be what we nostalgically remember as Bitcoin, but still work in that way. And there's this cultural bottleneck in front of progress. And probably the most culturally ossified would be the Bitcoin SV community, that is just everything original has to work exactly that way, except for bigger block size, and that's it. And that is absolutely perfect. And then we have the guy that we think created Bitcoin. He says all these things, and infinite scaling and all that stuff. And if you need to actually change the structure in any kind of way, oh no, it's not a real coin, it's Bitcoin, it's not Bitcoin anymore, it's a whatever. So all that culture kind of holds all the Bitcoin forks back, because it's part of that like originalist ethos that they sort of embraced. And lest you think that this is some sort of criticism exclusively of Bitcoin, it happens in the rest of the space too. Just think about any communities you've been in that just don't want to embrace a new change because we've always done things this way, or then they have some nostalgia behind a current structure, and they should probably change something, but they don't because of it. I mean, just imagine my governance. How many coins before everything had governance almost? How many non-DAO coins are just clinging on to the, well, we never needed a DAO before, let's just not complicate it with that. Think about it. What if Ethereum can make decisions, but the people behind it don't properly prioritize scaling and usability? What if Dash is the first decentralized autonomous organization, but its members don't make it keep up with its space and actually get its product to market? What if Decred is heavily focused on governance, but doesn't end up developing an end-user product anyone wants? The answer in all cases is, eventually, it'll fail. So is this too short? Are you looking for more? I have an audio-only version on, Spotify, Pandora, Apple Podcasts, all the other good places, and I always make those longer because you don't get the music or the visuals or any of the other stuff. And yeah, check those out if you want more. If not, if you're satisfied with the shorter version, you came to the right place, obviously. So I will see you guys next week.